Hello everyone, my name is Amanda and I'm a librarian at Tamworth and Central Northern Regional Libraries. I would like to welcome you to our virtual Q&A session with author Tania Blanchard. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the traditional lands of the Calabria people. I recognise their continuing connection to this land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal people present here today. As we are meeting online from different parts of the country, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to sea and community. So it is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce Australian author Tania Blanchard. Tania was inspired to write by the fascinating stories her German grandmother told her as a child. Coming from a family with a rich cultural heritage, stories have always been in her blood. Her first novel, The Girl from Munich, was a runaway bestseller, as was the sequel, Suitcase of Dreams. Tania currently lives in Sydney with her husband and 3 children. And if you have any questions for Tania, please write them in the chat box, and at the end of the Q&A, Tania will have the opportunity to answer those questions. So welcome, Tania, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone in Tamworth for joining in on our conversation tonight.
Okay, so we're here to discuss your latest novel, Echoes of War. I'll just hold up here for everyone to see. Can you please tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. Well, Echoes of War, I'll tell you a bit about the story first up. Echoes of War is set during the years before World War II, and it's set in southern Italy. And it's set at a time when Mussolini's fascist regime is at its height, and Mussolini has just sent young men to Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia in Eastern Africa, to war. So he's trying to expand his colonial empire and to rival like the old Roman Empire. So that's kind of the atmosphere that the story sets when it starts in 1936. And we start with our main character, Giulia, in a monastery. Giulia's brother Vincenzo is just been sent to war in Abyssinia, and she loves her family dearly, and she's worried about Vincenzo, but she also struggles against the strict upbringing from her parents. She wants to live a big life, and she wants to follow in her grandmother, her Nonna Mariana's footsteps, and become a healer. But the problem is she has this real conflict between duty to her family and to follow her dreams and her passions. But war is far from the tiny little village that Giulia comes from, right on the southern tip of the toe of Italy. But it draws ever closer as more and more men from the region are sent to war, first in Abyssinia, and then the Spanish Civil War, and then also Albania, until finally Italy joins World War II in 1940. And so a lot of the men have left and the women are left behind to run the farms. It's a big farming community, very agricultural, to run the villages and do everything that the men had done before they left. The women have always known that they're strong and that they will endure even without their men. And Giulia finds this as well, and she starts to find her voice and decides to follow her passion. But as the war progresses, it draws ever closer and it touches the village more and more until in 1943, the Allies invade Italy and war comes to Italian soil. It's a war that the Italian people have never thought would come to their shores. It's not a war they've asked for. But Giulia is really torn because she sees the terrible trauma that occurs to a lot of the Italian people that have been really touched and suffering by the war. And she wants to do so much more. She has to really find her feet and find her voice and work out what she's going to do to help the people of Italy. She can give so much more. And she has to find that balance between being there for her family and finding her passion and living her life. So it's really a story about a woman's determination to find her passion, her place in the world, and to find her path. And so then we followed Julia through the war.
Excellent. So what inspired you to write this story?
Well, it's really interesting, actually. I'd always thought I'd like to one day write my father's family story. So my father is Italian, from the southern part of Italy called Calabria. And one day I was at his house a few years ago, and I saw this photo on the fridge, and it was this man in uniform. It was a black and white photo, looked awfully like my dad. And so I said to him, "Who's this photo? Who's in the photo?" He said, "It's your grandfather." And I thought, I never knew that my grandfather went to war in World War II. I'd been told that he'd been exempt. And apparently he had been exempt, but he went to the war in Abyssinia and also in Albania. So this is something I never knew about my grandfather. And I found it absolutely fascinating to find this other part of my family story that I never knew about. And I was really intrigued about what he would have thought about going to Eastern Africa, you know, the exotic part of the world, far from his tiny village in southern Italy. And so that's what inspired Echoes of War.
Okay, so that leads me to the next question. Your books are inspired by true stories. So how hard is it to stay true to real events while writing fiction?
For me, it's really important to try and stay to true events. It's really the big moments in my family stories that I like to stay true to. It keeps the story authentic. But having said that, there's so much that I just don't know. So I can match the big moments in the family stories with the various historical events and things that are happening in their world. But then there's so much more that I need to do. So it's like making a skeleton, and then you need to flesh it out. So that's when the fiction comes in. And sometimes it means changing some of those family stories a little bit to make the story work, to really add that emotion in and to get it all to flow. So it's a bit of a collaboration between the true stories and also the fiction.
Excellent. And I've read all your novels while I was in lockdown, except for The Girl in Munich. It was a bit hard to source, so that's coming through soon. So I'll get reading once that arrives. So I was fascinated to read and learn about the historical events that took place. But is it a painful process for you to write about the horrific experiences that your family had to endure?
I guess it's a little bit removed because there's I suppose the closest relatives were my grandparents. But my grandmother told me such amazing stories that they didn't feel so difficult to write about. I felt like I knew them really well. And as far as my Italian grandparents, they actually died when I was fairly young. So there's that amount of, I suppose, distance from their actual personal stories. So I find that it can be difficult to write about them when you're really adding that deep emotion in. And that's probably the hardest part of writing any family story, or any story, in fact, is when you're trying to make it so authentic that you want to include those raw, deep emotions, because they have gone through some really traumatic experiences. But having said that as well, I try and balance it with research from historical sources, and that helps to give it that real authentic but sort of balanced view.
And when undertaking your research for Echoes of War, I'm just going to hold this up again so people can see, did you uncover any facts about Italy in the 30s or memories about your family that you were initially unaware of?
Yeah, there was a lot that I didn't know about, actually. So the story I just told you about my grandfather, but also I had no idea that Italy was involved in so many wars leading up to World War II. And I really didn't know very much about Italy's involvement in World War II either, having done the previous books from the German point of view. I knew a lot more about that. So I was really fascinated to learn about Mussolini and his fascist regime and how he sort of navigated his way towards World War II and how he wanted to expand so that Italy would become this great nation amongst Europe and a powerful neighbour to Germany, especially with the alliance with Hitler. So I found that sort of side of things really interesting, and I didn't know about that. But the other thing I found really amazing was the absolutely incredible and beautiful landscapes in Calabria. I always knew that they were beautiful, but until I did some more research, I never realised that there are these deep, rugged mountains, and also how ancient the landscape was. So I learnt that the ancient Greeks originally settled Calabria in the 8th century BC. So it's a really ancient land, steeped in really ancient traditions from the Greeks. There's still pockets of communities of people that speak a language called Greco, I think it's called, which is like an ancient sort of Greek language still. And a lot of the traditions that come down to the modern day have their origins in those Greek beginnings. The foods have been influenced by all the occupations by the different empires, so the Greeks and the Romans and the Ottomans and the Byzantines. It's quite a melting pot of cultures. So they were the really interesting things that I found while I was researching Echoes of War.
So talking about places, you have written about some of the most beautiful places in the world. And the way you describe them in your novels, as a reader, I felt like I was being transported to that place and time along with the characters. So my question is, have you had a chance to visit the places that you've written about, and what would be your favourite?
Wow, that's a good question. I haven't been able to go recently, no, unfortunately. I was very lucky though when I was 13 that I was able to travel to Germany and to Italy, where both my parents come from. So mum's from Germany and dad's from Italy, and see where they grew up. So I luckily had lots of those memories, being old enough to remember a lot of those beautiful places. I have to say though that I'm really captivated with Calabria. I really am. And I remember visiting when I was that age, and the pebbles on the beach and on the Mediterranean. And I remember the beautiful olive trees and the rugged landscape. But I suppose, and I remember Rome as well, that was like amazing, the ancient architecture and the ancient civilization. So I would have to say probably I really loved Rome. It was amazing. And Southern Calabria, there's so much more to tap into. It's such an old place with so many influences. I'd love to go back there one day and sort of discover more stories, I think. I was meant to go there when COVID hit, and just follow up on family members and take myself to places that really drew me and that I really wanted to write about. But unfortunately, I had to rely on photos and stories from my aunt and my father who had been there the year before. So I was really fortunate, at least, that I had that, so they could tell me how things were now and how they were when they remembered them when they were younger. So I was really fortunate to have that.
Excellent. I'll definitely be adding them to my travel list when we're all back up and running.
Yeah.
So the main character, Julia, is training to be a healer under the guidance of her nonna. However, her father isn't overly happy with the arrangement, as he tends to have a bias towards traditional medicine, and often he refers it to witchcraft.
Yeah.
Was this the general consensus by many in that time? And why do you think that was?
Yeah, look, I think it was a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. I think a lot of the people who lived in Calabria at the time, that had lived there all their lives, took on the traditional folk healing as part of their life. They'd grown up with it, they'd been treated by it. The folk healers were respected members of the community. And there was this feeling that there was something beyond the physical that could affect health. And a lot of Italians, or especially Calabrians, will tell you that they believe in Jesus and Mary and the saints, and that they can sort of intercede and give miracles and help when they pray for help. So I think it's along that kind of line. The really interesting thing was that kind of idea of witchcraft actually came from centuries before. So there's a long line of religious beliefs in the region. And so I think in the early days, it was more pagan related due to the ancient Greeks. But then as Catholicism took over, it became the part of religion. So it was the realm of religion and the miracles that Mary and Jesus and the Madonna could provide. So I think it was more that kind of feeling. Although there were some people that definitely thought, look, this is rubbish. This is witchcraft. I don't want you performing any of this at all. But the major consensus was that this is just part of life.
So this brings me to the next question. For me, Julie's father was not an overly likable character. I found him a bit domineering, a bit close-minded, and I guess in reading from my time to the 30s, he came across as a little sexist in terms of where a woman's place in the world should be. So what is the biggest challenge with writing characters like, is it Andrea? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Andrea,
Because obviously as a writer, you want your readers to like your characters, but at the same time, you do want to stay true to the cultural traditions of that time.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of a challenge to write Andrea's character. I didn't want him to be unlikable altogether, but as you say, I wanted to stay authentic to what his character might have been like, and certainly it provided a great conflict for Julia, of course. So he was a really great foil for her growth and development. And certainly I think beneath that gruff exterior of a traditional Southern Italian man, there usually is a heart of gold. And I think what I was trying to show with the character was that he loves Julia, as all fathers love their daughters, but he believed that his way was the right way. And that certainly is very much a cultural thing. Luckily for me, I was able to get a little bit of insight into what that kind of character might be like through family members, usually the much older generation now. So that made it a little bit easier to write that kind of character.
Excellent. So in the book, a lot of discussions and decisions that Julie's family have are around the dinner table, enjoying beautiful food. And as you probably know, not many Australian traditions take place around the dinner table. Usually it's in front of a TV or when parents come home late at night and their kids are already fed. Is this a tradition you carry on with your family, and do you love to cook?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it was the way that I grew up with an Italian father. Lots of Sundays were at my grandparents' place. All the aunts and uncles would come and there'd be cooking and just mountains of food on the table. And that's something that I still love to do these days. Whenever I get the opportunity, I'd love to have all my family over and we all sit at the table and we eat food that we enjoy and we converse and talk about what's been happening in our lives. Sadly, of course, that hasn't been able to happen very much with the COVID lockdowns, and something that we really miss a lot. On a family level, we do try and sit down at the table a few times a week and do exactly that. My children love to help in the kitchen. They love to cook, as does my husband. So I'm really fortunate that the whole family enjoys cooking. Excuse me. And so it's not hard at all for us to congregate and talk and eat together. But of course, these days it's just such a busy life, and it's getting harder and harder to get everyone around the table. Everyone's living their own lives and busy doing their own things, and it is a bit of a struggle, but everyone in my family knows that it's really important to me and that we make that time to spend together. And I'm hoping that my children one day will carry on that tradition as well.
Yeah, beautiful. And I love reading books that have strong female characters, and that is what I have noticed about all your books. It seems to be a recurring theme. For example, in Echoes of War, the women, they fight for education, they stay and look after the farms while the men are at war.
Yep.
And of course, they fight to marry for love and not by an arrangement.
Yep.
In Suitcase of Dreams, Lottie worked tirelessly to put food on the table and make a home for her family after her husband got injured. And in Letters of Berlin, Susanna went to great lengths to help her family survive. How important is it to give these women a voice, particularly when most war novels are from the male perspective?
Look, behind every man there is a great woman, you know, and I think there are so many stories out there of women that we just don't know about. And that's the one thing I've really loved about looking into my family history, is that there are women that just grab my attention, and they're strong women. They've made a difference in their families' lives, and they've really sort of taken my attention, and I've wanted to write about them. I think women's stories just haven't been told until rather recently. And they're always the hidden strength behind the male stories. There's always an amazing female story lurking there somewhere, and that's something I'm always really drawn to, and I'll continue writing female stories.
Excellent. So Echoes of War, it's your fourth novel. So what has been your favourite book you have written, and why?
Oh, that's a really hard one, because each of them is really special to me. They're all family stories. Of course, the very first one, The Girl from Munich, the story is based on my grandmother's life growing up in Germany during World War II. And she would tell us all these stories growing up. So I think being my very first story, and being so personal about my grandmother, who only passed away sort of 6 years ago, and being the story that I first got published, I think I would probably have to say that has to be my absolute favourite story.
And what do you hope your readers take away from your books?
Yeah, look, what I'd really love readers to take away are the things that I've learnt while researching and writing the story. I think the stories that I've written offer sort of fresh and different perspectives on the war. So we've got the German perspective of World War II, and obviously the Italian perspective of World War II. And certainly the Italian perspective was not a perspective I really knew very much about before I started researching and writing. And even the German perspective, I knew that a lot of people would not know very much about what it was like for the Germans during the war. And obviously I'd heard that from my grandmother, but there weren't many stories out there about that. So I think that's the most important thing. So what did you just ask? I've got this away in the conversation.
What do you hope readers take away from it?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, there's that. So the offering that new perspective, and also I think other things that I've learned from researching and writing the stories, like the big, beautiful landscapes and the culture of Calabria, and of Germany, of course, too. And the really interesting stories that just haven't been told. So I think they're the things that I'd love people to take away, is just the things that I've learnt and that I've found fascinating in my stories.
So that should lead us to our next question about, tell us about your writing process. Do you have a certain ritual, space, time you prefer to write?
Yeah, I'm really lucky that I have my own space to write in. At the moment, we're all in lockdown under one roof, so everyone's working and studying from home. But I'm lucky I still have my office space, so that's quiet and private. And I try and work sort of most days when the kids are organised for school. I've still got 2 boys at school. So from about sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, and I try and work through till sort of 4 in the afternoon. And that's most days of the week, usually 5 days a week. I try to write to a word count during the week so that I can progress the story forward. And I guess the other thing is that I try to continue writing new words every day rather than going back and rehashing and editing the work that I've already done. Again, it's just so that I can then get to that first draft of the manuscript. And then I will go back and sort of review what I've already written in that first draft and sort of add more nuance and flesh it out a bit more and scrap bits that aren't working.
So are you currently working on anything at the moment that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm working on another novel. This time I'm looking at my husband's family history, looking at his father's side of the family. And I'm looking at setting the story around the late Victorian era in England. So around the turn of the 20th century, it was a really fascinating period. Lots of social change, lots of industrial change. And the heroine of the story is a woman who is a school teacher and runs a pub in northern England, just at the time when her town turns from being an agricultural town to a coal mining town. So it's a really fascinating period to research and write about, and I'm really excited about this story.
I look forward to reading it.
Thank you.
So do you get a chance to read? And if so, what are you currently reading?
I'm actually just in between books at the moment. Having been in lockdown, I haven't managed to get myself another book to read. What I've just recently finished reading is The Last of the Apple Blossom by Mary Lou Stevens. And that's a beautiful book by a debut author, and I absolutely recommend it. So it's set in in Tasmania during the 1960s and 70s, and it's about the apple orchard industry. So that was a really beautiful book. But what I'd like to read next, when I get a hold of it, is The Evening and the Morning by Ken Follett. So it's the prequel to Pillars of the Earth, that great big historical epics. So I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on that one.
They're on my bookshelves to read, and I haven't yet delved into them yet. I just keep looking at them and thinking to myself, oh, one day.
Yeah, you have to be in the mood. You have to be ready to read a certain book, I think. It calls to you at a particular time.
So what are your three favourite books?
Oh, my three favourite books. Wow. Okay. I think one of them has to be the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. I love the way she writes. It's very sensory and beautiful descriptions and beautiful historical background, and very, authentic. So, and the big stories. So I love her books. I suppose, like I mentioned a minute ago, Ken Follett, Pillars of the Earth, another big historical epic set in the 12th century in the cathedral building in England, and the story about a very ordinary family who's actually working on the cathedral. So I love stories, big stories about ordinary people. And the third one, you think, what would be my third favourite book? You know what, something I've read just recently over the last Christmas holidays was His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. I know that's something a little bit different. It's more sort of young adult, but I loved his fantasy world. It rivals, the Lord of the Rings, I think. So I absolutely adored his fantasy world, and it was amazing. So that would be probably my third.
Okay, excellent. I'll just put that one on my list as well. I love fantasy novels as well. So my last question before we hand over to the audience is, when you are not writing, what do you enjoy doing in your spare time?
Yeah, well, when in my spare time, I love to read. And, anything really, historical, fantasy, anything I can pretty well get my hands on. And that tends to be usually in that lovely time between Christmas and New Year. I just sit and read. The other thing I love to do in my spare time is cook, as you well know. I love to get into the kitchen and cook up a storm with the family, try new recipes, favourites as well, and just sit down and sit around a table and eat and talk with everyone. So that's something I love to do. And the other thing, I suppose, is walking my dog. But this beautiful little 18-month-old Groodle. She's a lockdown puppy, and she's just brought so much love and joy into our house, and she's a delight. So I take her walking, which is good exercise for me and good exercise for her.
Yeah, they make the day so pleasurable when you're just at home, don't they?
Yeah, they sure do. It makes such a difference.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed reading your books, Tanya. I'm just going to hold them up again for people. Oh, don't need to see my little. So these are all the books. I'm yet to get The Girl from Munich.
Oh, here we go. I've got this one here. Oh, where are we? We're over here.
I definitely know it's
Here we are.
Coming to me.
There we go. That's The Girl from Munich as well.
Excellent. So I look forward to reading that. So I want to thank you for your time chatting with me, and I'm just going to go and check the chat box to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Sounds great.
So we don't have any questions currently, but if you'd like to ask Tanya a question, please write in the chat box, or you're more than welcome to turn off your microphone and turn on your video and ask the question if you're happy and comfortable to be recorded for this session. So we might just give people a little bit of time to. Why people are, oh, here we go. From Cassandra, what is the most shocking or surprising thing you've learnt while writing Echoes of War?
Ooh, that's a really good question, actually. I was really fascinated to learn about the medical advances during World War II. So when the Allies came to Italy, they made these fantastic advances in the healing of gunshot wounds and broken limbs. So that was really interesting to sort of delve into the kind of injuries that happen on the battlefront. So they were traveling through mountain passes and really difficult terrain against the Germans. And some really fascinating injuries were like trench foot, where they would be in wet, cold conditions, in the pouring rain and flooded rivers they have to traverse, and they would have to get treatment from these terrible injuries. And something as simple as being in wet feet with wet socks and wet shoes would give them these terrible injuries on their feet, where they were unable to walk, and if they were left badly enough would become sort of gangrenous and they'd have to have amputations. So I found it really fascinating to learn about the amazing advances in battlefront and medical treatment and surgical treatment during the war. So yeah, that was really quite intriguing.
Okay, any more questions? In case people are typing, I'll just remind everybody that the session with Tanya is being recorded and will be made available on the Tamworth Library Facebook page and the Central Northern Regional Library's YouTube channel. So you can pop on and watch once they're loaded to the platforms. Also, Tanya's books are available for loan through the Central Northern Regional Library website. So go on and reserve your copies, or pop in and see your local librarian. So I'll just double check the chat box. So no more questions from the audience. Well, I would like to, oh yes, Tara. Suitcase of Dreams and The Girl from Munich, and no doubt your new novel, provide a generous insight into the lives of your family members. Do you feel a responsibility? And she's still typing.
Yeah.
Oh, and or need to get permission from family.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tara. Thank you so much for that. Yes, it is a great responsibility when you're writing a family story. When I started with The Girl from Munich, and I had the idea to write my grandmother's story, I felt really nervous about asking my mother how she would feel about me writing her family story. And thankfully she was absolutely supportive of the idea. But yeah, I try to keep family names private, and some of the really personal aspects of the stories private, especially for living family members. I think that's really important, and I need to tread carefully with the story to make sure that each part of the actual family story is dealt with respectfully. So it is really important, I think, when you're melding family story with fiction, that it is done in a really sensitive manner. So that's really very important to me.
So have any of your family members read parts of your books and said, no, you need to remove that?
You know what? Thankfully not.
Oh,
Thankfully
great.
not. Yeah. And not that anyone said to me anyway, I have to say. I know when I wrote The Girl from Munich, obviously Lottie it's a coming of age story of Lottie. She's 18 at the beginning of the story. And so inevitably there are some, sex scenes involved in the story. And I felt that my mother was a little bit tentative about reading the sex scenes in the beginning. But then she got used to the way that I was writing and understood that it was still a fictional story at the end of the day, and she was fine about it. So I think that was probably the most tricky part.
Yeah. And so Tanya has added, you do it so well and beautiful, by the way.
Oh, thank you so very much.
Okay, well, I think that's, yep, I don't think she's typing some more. So again, Tanya, thank you so much for spending some time with us. It's been a great interview, and hopefully next time your new book comes out, we can see you in person down at in Tamworth.
That would be amazing, Amanda. I'd love to come to Tamworth. Yeah, it's nothing quite like me meeting people face to face and talking to them sort of, in an actual library setting. So that would be really lovely. But thank you so much for your lovely questions today. And it was really nice to chat to you about Echoes of War and writing.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our audience members that signed in. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone in Tamworth, for checking in and for listening to the conversation. It was lovely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Amanda.
Bye-bye.
Bye.